In the last video, we talked about labs that want to use radioactive material, and we said that they really have to apply for paperwork and get a sheet of paper, a license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Then they have to make sure that they're disposing of that based on the state nuclear regulatory agencies that are involved, and all of this documentation also has to include a radiation safety program. Well, part of the CFR is going to focus on the radioactivity. So the CFR is going to come around again, but this time the chapter is different. This is looking at 10 CFR, and this is 10 CFR Part 20. That's where you're going to find a lot of the radioactive kind of guidelines and regulations that have to be instilled in these laboratories and companies across the United States. So the very first thing that we need to mention is ALARA. And ALARA is a pretty hot topic in radioactivity because that basically means exposure. So what kind of exposure are you giving your people that work in a lab or that's around this radioactive substance? And what ALARA stands for is A for as, L is low, A is as, again, R is reasonable, and then the last A stands for achievable. So they encourage ALARA exposure, and ALARA is as low as reasonably achievable. They don't really care what type of compound it is. If it's radioactive, no matter how radioactive, no matter the health defects from it or ailments that you can get from it, they want you to minimize that exposure as much as possible. So if there's a radioactive stamp, ALARA is going to be very important. What can you do as a company to make sure that your lab workers and your employees are exposed to these things as low as reasonably possible? They also have to stay in compliance with what we call maximum dose limits. So all of these compounds will typically have a maximum dose limit, meaning this is as much as you can be exposed to on a daily basis, a weekly basis, an hourly basis, whatever the case is. That's the maximum dose limit. You have to make sure that your workers, including the lab personnel, do not go above the maximum dose limit. And if they do have the chance of doing that, then you have to rotate those people out, meaning that they will keep you working with that radioactive substance up to a certain point, and then they will force you to leave, and another person will come in and pick up the job that you're doing, just to make sure that they are not breaking this regulation. All of this requires documentation. All of this requires paperwork, more red tape, and you can kind of see why. We don't want anything bad to happen to you at all, right? With 10 CFR Part 20, they also encourage these companies to have what we call a radiation safety officer on the plant, a person that specializes in all the radioactive material that a worker might be exposed to, and or committee. So depending on the size of the company, then this committee could be a group of people that helps make these decisions and helps enforce these laws. Monitoring and securing sources of radiation is also a part of this CFR. So monitoring means there's got to be a careful eye on the radioactive material at all points in time. It has to stay locked up. It has to stay in a closed room. It can't just be out in the open for workers to expose themselves with it. And that is also part of securing it as well, right? So if someone needs that reagent, very often you will go to a desk and you will sign your name onto this sheet, and that person will go to a locked storage room. They will get that reagent that you will need. They will bring it back up to the window. They will give it to you. They will write down the amount of grams or whatever the case is that they've given to you. And then when you're done with it, you take it back to that same check-in desk. You give it back to the person that's standing behind there. You sign off on it again. They will weigh it to see how much you've used. and then they can take it back into the secured locker room all over again. So this is pretty important stuff, and it's not to be taken lightly. So some of these things are locked up tighter than drugs are, and you can kind of see why. So maintaining and securing sources of the radiation is going to be very important. Next, with that monitoring and securing, designation is also very important. So they want to know where it's kept, how it's kept, who is going to oversee it. So designated locations, that's where these things have to be kept at all points in time. You also have to have proper signage. So wherever that is kept or wherever it's going to be used, you have to have a radioactive label. And that label typically is going to be put on the front of a door, so that way anyone that steps into that room is aware of radioactive substances that could be present. Finally, as part of all of this, we've mentioned this before, but training and record keeping is going to be important. So training your employees and making sure that you keep that paperwork on file so you can prove to someone that you did get that training with radioactive material. The good thing about this, though, is that these companies that have radioactivity, you often see unannounced. They will just show up at the door inspections. So they will come in on a random day at a random time, and they will just look through to make sure that everything is going according to plan. And if so, you get check marks, you get a pat on the back, and away they go. But if they find something that is not kind of in sync with what they believe, then citations will be given out. Again, they have no right to close a company down, but they have every right to issue a citation, give you a fine, and they pay the government for whatever citation or law that they broke. Okay, so that's a little bit about radioactivity, instrumentation, and chemicals, and the hurdles that people have to go through if they have this material on site. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on, try to finish this lecture up with this video. And something that I want to say now is that in 1996, we have an anti-terrorism, if I can spell it right, terrorism and effective death penalty act. Okay. Keep in mind, we've got radioactive materials and reagents now. We have hazardous chemicals. We have biological agents that are viruses and bacteria. I mean, some of this stuff is pretty nasty, right? And these laboratories could be a target for terrorism, meaning that someone could storm into a laboratory, take some of these hazardous compounds that could kill entire towns or cities, and they could steal away with it and off go do, the devil's bidding, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So in 1996, we get the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that was established. And what it said is that chemicals cannot be used for terrorist purposes. That's kind of stupid, isn't it? But that's your politicians at work. They did something good, right? They felt that it was needed to say that chemicals cannot be used for terrorist purposes. I think that was kind of assumed, but in 1996, that's what was established. And what they did is that this panel of people, and some of them made up of scientists, went through and they made a list. And 80 of them were what we would call select agents. And this included many of the biologicals, the viruses and the bacterias. That was typically the easiest one that terrorists could maybe get a hold of and spread, right? A chemical spill is different than a virus spill. Okay, think of that. So if you infect one person, then that one person could end up affecting millions more, versus a chemical spill that could be dumped down into a river or a lake or a stream. So 80 of them were what we would call select agents, and a lot of these were typical viruses and plagues that we have done away with in the past, or maybe that were future ones that we want antibodies and vaccines for. And it says that if an agent has to be used in a lab, these labs have to get what we call registration, and they have to get approval in order to use them. You have to get it granted. If you are using one of these 80 select agents in your laboratory and you do not register and get approval to use them, then that's bad news bears. All right? They have to know where these things are located. They have to know what companies are using them. They have to know why you're using them. And they have to know how you will store them and keep them secure at your employer. So the CDC is involved in this, of course, the Center for Disease Control, right? They focus on pathogens and they focus on toxins. And then the USDA is also involved in this, and they are focused on the animal pathogens. Not only do we worry about people, but we do worry about the animals too, right? Violating this act is criminal charge. If you have one of these 80 and you do not get approval and you do not register your location, then that could be a criminal charge because you are a danger to society. Meaning that if a terrorist found out that you were using one of these 80 and they broke into your lab and they stole one of these 80, it is your fault that now maybe entire populations are at risk. Now, these 80 select agents, they can be found. You just have to type in Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. 80 select agents and all 80 will pop up, and you can kind of read through. That's not the purpose of this lecture. It's not the purpose of any kind of future lab question that I might give on a test or a quiz. But there's about 80 of them in total. Now, in addition to this, more details. Hope I've not bombarded you with details yet. But we have Code of Federal Regulations, a different chapter, 42 now, part 73. And this includes what we would call a security plan. A security plan has to be in place with these companies. You have to limit the access to these nasty things. And because of that, certain companies will require only certain personnel to work in areas, a swapper badge to open doors up, only certain people can remove products from the actual containment units, only certain people can receive the products. It has to be tracked. So security plans have to be in place, and they have to be pretty strict. This also includes criminal background checks. That's why they do them, people. So if you apply for a job and they need a criminal background check, they want to make sure that you're not going to be a danger or a risk to the company, because chances are you could come in contact with these radioactive substances or with the hazardous substances that are on site. Next are designated areas, of course. That also falls under this. We see that over and over and over. You have to have a designated area for all of these reagents and stuff that you are quite nasty. The guidelines for safety have to be followed by the CDC and the NIH, which is National Institute of Health. The CDC and the NIH will give you recommendations. Yeah, that's a scribble. And these recommendations have to be followed. If you're going to be using these types of materials, then you have to follow their suggestions, and you have to be as strict as the CDC or NIH would be with their own labs. Now, this kind of rules out the small mom and pop places. The small mom and pop places typically do not have the personnel, they do not have the money, they do not have the areas that this would be approved in. So we're really talking about large industry large industrial type of settings of chemical manufacturers and suppliers and research labs. You can only use what's approved on the permit. So whenever you're issued a permit, they will give you a maximum amount. And this maximum amount can never be violated. So if they say you can only have 20 grams of this stuff, then that's it. 20 grams, no more. If you have any more than 20 grams at any point in time, it's over, right? You have just violated the terms of agreement, and that could actually be a criminal charge. So you can only use what's approved on the permit once they issue it. You can also transfer to another lab, but you can't transfer unless that company or unless that lab is also approved. So let's say that one lab gets it and they realize, hey, you're doing something similar, you want some of it? We'll sell it to you. And that other lab says, sure, we'll buy some from you. Well, a transfer happens from one lab to the next. They have to make sure that the lab that they're transferring it to is also approved. That lab has to have the required documentation, just like you had to have when you obtained that stuff to study or to do work with. So these steps, all of these steps up here, they are known as the Select Agent Program. That's abbreviated as SAP, Select Agent Program. All right, so I think that's where I'm going to stop this video. We probably have one more left. I told you this was all details in this one, and now you're kind of seeing the nitty-gritty that goes on behind laboratory safety and safety culture. So we've got one more video, a couple of more notes to take, and then you'll probably be finished with the entire lecture module itself. So don't give up on me yet. Come back, finish it up, complete that last assignment, and you'll be good to go.